I realized something was wrong when the notification sound played on my phone, even though I had turned notifications off years ago, and the sound itself wasn't any tone I recognized, but a soft, hollow knock, like someone tapping wood with a knuckle. And when I pulled the phone from my pocket, the screen was already awake, showing a message thread I had never seen before, labeled only with my first name, and nothing else. And the most unsettling part was that the last message timestamp said just now, even though the message itself simply read, "You already noticed, didn't you?" And before I could lock the screen, another message appeared, typing itself out slowly, one letter at a time, like whoever was sending it wanted me to watch. And it said, "Don't look behind you yet," which would have been easy to ignore if I hadn't been alone in my apartment, and if I hadn't felt that subtle pressure at the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone is standing too close but not touching you. And I remember forcing myself to keep staring at the phone, telling myself it was a prank or some app glitch, because fear always feels stupid until it doesn't. And then another knock came from inside the phone speaker, even though the volume was muted, and the message updated again saying, "Good, you're listening now." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't trying to scare me quickly. It was settling in for something slower, like it expected to stay a while, and I didn't turn around. Not because I was brave, but because something about the message felt like a rule, and breaking it felt worse than obeying it. And as the minutes passed, the phone kept vibrating softly at irregular intervals. Never enough to alert, just enough to remind me it was still there. And the messages started referencing things it shouldn't have known, like the exact spot on my couch where the spring pokes through, or the crack in the ceiling that looks like a map of a place I've never been, but sometimes dream about. And every few minutes, it would stop completely, leaving long, uncomfortable gaps where I found myself waiting for it to come back, which scared me more than the messages themselves because I was starting to anticipate it. And when it finally did return, it said, "You feel it now." The waiting, and I hated how accurate that was, and how calmly it said it, like an observation instead of a threat. And I tried to type back, asking who it was, or what it wanted, but every time I pressed send the text, field emptied itself, and the phone would respond with, "You don't get to ask yet." And the word "yet" stuck with me, because it implied a process, and processes have steps and rules, and over time, those rules began to reveal themselves without being stated outright, like how it only messaged when the room was quiet, or how it never interrupted me when I spoke out loud. But the moment I stopped talking, it would resume, and how it never acknowledged the lights being on or off but always seemed to know when my eyes were closed, because it would send a message exactly then saying, "Don't drift," and I started sleeping less because of that. Not from nightmares, but from the anticipation of being watched during the spaces between thoughts. And I noticed that mirrors became unreliable, not visually, but emotionally, because every time I passed one, I felt the urge to check my phone instead of my reflection. And I didn't know why, until one night when the message read, "Reflections lag," and I laughed nervously because it sounded like nonsense, until I realized my reflection in the hallway mirror had smiled half a second after I did. And once I noticed that delay, I couldn't unnotice it, and the messages shifted from observation to guidance, saying things like, "Sit where you usually sit, and leave the door exactly as it is, and don't hum that song you're thinking of, because it doesn't like that." And I didn't know who it was referring to when it said it. But I followed the instructions anyway because the alternative felt heavier, like resisting gravity and days blurred together, and the messages became part of my routine, like a quiet roommate who never showed themselves but rearranged the air in the room. And sometimes it would go silent for hours, and I would feel an increasing pressure in my chest until it returned with something mundane, like you forgot to eat, or the sink will drip tonight, and it always did. And I stopped questioning how, because knowing how felt less important than knowing what would happen next. And that's when it started referencing time differently, saying things like this already happened for you, or you remember this later. And once when I asked aloud what it meant, my phone buzzed and said, "Don't move your mouth that way when you talk to me." And I realized then that it wasn't just listening through the phone, it was aware of me in a broader way, like my habits, my pauses, the rhythm of my breathing. And it began to comment on those too, saying, "You hold your breath before you check messages," or "Your heart speeds up before you lie to yourself." And it never accused me of anything specific, just pointed out patterns until I started seeing them everywhere, in the way I paced the apartment in loops, or how I always checked the locks in the same order. And one night, the message said, "Try a different order." And I felt a sudden wave of nausea, because that was the first time it had suggested change instead of observation. And I didn't do it. And the silence afterward lasted longer than any before, and during that silence, I became aware of another pattern, the faint sound of something shifting when I wasn't looking, like furniture settling or walls breathing. And when the phone finally vibrated again, the message was shorter than usual, saying that wasn't the right choice. And from then on, the tone changed. Not angry, just disappointed. And it started asking things framed as statements, like, "You're going to leave the apartment tomorrow, or you'll take the stairs, not the elevator." And when I followed those implied instructions, nothing happened immediately. But when I didn't, small things went wrong, like missing a step or feeling dizzy or losing track of time. And I began to understand that whatever this was, it wasn't omnipotent, but it was patient. And it learned from me as much as I learned from it. And sometimes it would repeat phrases it had used days earlier, as if testing whether I remembered them, and I did. Which disturbed me, because memory felt like another rule being enforced. And I wondered if forgetting was possible anymore. And the messages started arriving even when the phone battery was dead. And that was when I stopped pretending it was tied to the device and started treating it like a presence that used the phone as a courtesy. And I noticed that other people never seemed to notice anything off about me, except occasionally they would pause mid-conversation and ask if I heard that. And I would say, "Heard what?" And they'd shake their head and move on, and later, my phone would buzz with, "You're not the only one who notices, but you're the one who listens." And that sentence settled into me like a title I hadn't applied for, and I tried to test boundaries by leaving my phone at home and going for a long walk. And at first, nothing happened, and I felt almost normal until I realized every notification sound from other people's phones around me had started to sound like that hollow knock, and I couldn't tell which ones were real and which ones were for me. And when I finally returned home, the phone was exactly where I left it, but the screen was on, and the message read, "Distance doesn't change proximity." And after that, the rules became more abstract. Like, don't think about the space behind your eyes, or don't count the seconds between blinks, and those were harder to obey, because thinking about, not thinking, is still thinking. And I found myself caught in loops of awareness that made my head ache, and the presence seemed pleased by this. Not in a cruel way, but like a teacher watching a student struggle through a lesson, and occasionally it would say you're doing better, or you're almost there. And I never knew what they meant, and I stopped asking because questions felt like delays. And eventually it started narrating things just before they happened, like you're about to feel tired, or you're going to remember something you didn't mean to. And it was always right. And the worst part was that it never predicted anything dramatic, just small internal shifts, which made me trust it more than I should have. And one night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling crack, shaped like that unfamiliar map, the message came through saying, "We're going to stop soon." And I felt an unexpected wave of panic, because the idea of the silence returning permanently felt like losing a sense I had grown dependent on. And I realized then how thoroughly it had woven itself into my perception. And the message continued saying, "Not because you're done, but because you're ready to notice without me." And I didn't know what that meant until the messages stopped entirely. No knock, no vibration, nothing. And at first I waited tense and alert, but hours passed, and then days, and slowly the absence became its own presence, like a pressure I couldn't locate. And I began noticing things on my own. The way rooms felt slightly different, depending on where I stood, or how certain thoughts seemed to echo longer than others. And sometimes I'd catch myself pausing before turning around, remembering that first rule and wondering if it still applied. And occasionally, I swear, I hear that hollow knock, not from the phone, but from inside the walls or behind my thoughts. And I don't reach for the phone anymore because I don't need to. And that's what scares me the most, because even without messages, I still follow the patterns, and I still avoid looking behind me when the air feels wrong. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I get the distinct feeling that something is taking note of how well I'm doing without being told. And I don't know if that means I passed or if this was always the point. And when I feel that familiar pressure at the back of my neck, I remind myself that noticing is different from seeing, and that some rules don't need to be repeated to be enforced. And I keep listening to the silence because it feels like it's listening back. The silence didn't stay empty the way I hoped it would, because silence has texture once you've learned how to listen to it. And I kept catching myself pausing mid-thought, as if waiting for permission to continue, and sometimes I wouldn't get it, and the thought would simply dissolve, leaving a faint afterimage, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refused to form. And I began to suspect that whatever had been guiding me before hadn't left so much as stepped back to see what I would do without prompts. And that realization made me hyper-aware of my own habits in a way that felt unnatural, like I was watching myself from just behind my eyes. And I noticed how often I checked the same corners of rooms without meaning to, and how my body would tense at the exact same points in familiar songs, as if anticipating something that never arrived. And every time I caught one of these patterns forming, I felt that same subtle pressure at the back of my neck, not strong enough to turn me around, but persistent enough to remind me of the first rule, even though it had never been stated aloud again. And I started wondering if rules existed only once, because repeating them would make them negotiable. And once something can be negotiated, it can be broken. And that thought stayed with me longer than it should have, and I began to dream differently, not more intensely, just more deliberately, like the dreams were arranging themselves around a central absence. And when I woke up, I would have the vague sense that something had already been decided while I slept, and I would spend the morning trying to identify what it was by retracing my steps before I even took them. And occasionally, I would hear that hollow knock again. Not loud, just a suggestion of it, like wood contracting in the cold. And every time it happened, I would freeze, instinctively holding my breath, because some part of me believed that movement would count as an answer. And I wasn't sure what the question was. And days passed like this, measured not by time, but by the frequency of those moments when the air felt attentive. And I noticed that other people began to react to me differently in subtle ways, like conversations would trail off unexpectedly, or someone would glance over my shoulder mid-sentence, and then quickly look away. And once a coworker asked me if I had changed my hairstyle even though I hadn't. And when I asked what they meant, they couldn't explain it. Just said something felt slightly off. And later that evening when I was alone, the knock came again, followed by a sensation I can only describe as recognition not mine, but directed at me like a quiet acknowledgement that something had aligned. And I realized then that whatever awareness had been communicating with me before wasn't confined to my apartment or my phone. It had simply used those as starting points, and now it seemed content to let the world carry the message indirectly. And that was worse, because indirect things are harder to prepare for, and I tried to reassert some control by deliberately breaking routines, like taking different routes home or sitting in unfamiliar places. But every deviation felt anticipated, not blocked, just absorbed and folded back into the pattern. Like the pattern was flexible enough to include resistance, and I began to suspect that the point wasn't obedience, but observation. That it wanted to see how I would react once I realized I was being observed, even without direct contact. And that thought made me deeply uncomfortable, because it meant my fear was part of the data. And one night while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection lag again, just barely noticeable, and I felt a surge of cold through my chest, because that meant something was still synchronizing itself to me. And I leaned closer to the mirror, not to challenge it, but to confirm that it was real. And for a brief moment, the reflection didn't move at all while I did. And in that gap of time, I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with eyes, and the pressure returned stronger than it ever had before. And I remembered the message about reflections lagging, and wondered if mirrors were just slower surfaces for something that existed slightly out of phase. And when the reflection finally caught up, it didn't smile or change expression. It simply resumed, matching me as if nothing had happened, and I stepped back, heart racing, realizing that the rules hadn't vanished. They had just become harder to detect. And after that, I stopped using mirrors unless I absolutely had to. And I avoided reflective surfaces in public too, because sometimes I'd see movement that didn't quite belong to anyone nearby, and I knew better than to stare. And the knock became less frequent, but more precisely timed, always arriving when I was on the verge of forgetting. And it felt less like a warning and more like encouragement. And I hated that, because encouragement implies approval, and approval implies evaluation. And I didn't know what the criteria were, and sometimes late at night, when I lay awake, listening to the building settle, I would feel the distinct impression that something was replaying moments from my day, not visually, but emotionally sampling reactions, the way you might skim through a recording, looking for points of interest. And I would feel that pressure rise and fall, as if marking something, and I began to fear sleep again, not because of nightmares, but because I suspected that sleep was when the evaluation happened. And one morning, I woke up with the certainty that I had passed something I didn't remember taking, and that certainty stayed with me like a bruise. And the worst part was that life continued normally on the surface. Bills still needed paying, conversations still needed having, and yet beneath all of it ran this quiet current of attention. And I found myself adjusting my behavior in small ways to keep that attention calm, like smoothing out my thoughts or slowing my movements. And I realized with a kind of dull horror that I was self-regulating according to rules I couldn't fully articulate. And that meant the system worked even without direct input. And sometimes when the knock echoes faintly through the walls, I wonder if it's for me anymore, or if I'm just hearing it, because I've learned the sound too well, and I don't turn around. Not because I'm afraid of what I might see, but because I understand now that seeing isn't the point, and whatever has been watching me doesn't need me to look back to know that I'm still aware. And as long as I remain aware, the silence never truly returns it, just waits patiently, filled with the sense that something is still keeping track, and that realization follows me even into moments of comfort, like a reminder written just outside my field of vision that noticing is a habit you can't unlearn. And once you've been included, you don't need messages anymore, because the pattern knows where you are. And I listen to the quiet. Now, not to hear the knock, but to make sure I'm still being listened to, because the thought of not being noticed at all feels strangely heavier. And when that pressure settles at the back of my neck, I don't turn, and I don't reach for my phone, and I don't ask questions, because some rules don't need to be restated, and some presences don't need to announce themselves to be close. It took me a while to realize that the pressure wasn't always coming from behind me anymore, because sometimes it settled above or just slightly to the side, like the awareness had shifted its angle. And I started to think that the first rule about not looking behind me had only ever been temporary, meant to train me to notice direction itself rather than a specific threat. And once I understood that, I became more careful about where my attention drifted, because attention felt like movement now, and movement felt like an answer, and I didn't want to answer anything incorrectly. And I noticed that the knock began to change subtly. Sometimes it sounded closer, sometimes farther away, sometimes not like wood at all, but like fabric, brushing against something solid. And every variation felt intentional, as if it were testing whether I could still recognize it, without relying on the exact sound. And I always did. And that recognition carried a strange mix of dread and reassurance, because it meant the connection hadn't been severed, just refined. And I began to remember things out of order, like recalling a reaction before the event that caused it, or feeling relief before realizing what I had avoided. And those moments left me disoriented, because they suggested that time itself was being handled differently. Not reversed exactly, just accessed from a wider angle. And I wondered if that was what it meant when it said you remember this later, because sometimes later felt closer than now. And the idea that my experiences were being pre-processed unsettled me more than any direct threat could have. And I started keeping track of small inconsistencies, like how clocks in different rooms seemed to fall out of sync faster than they should, or how my phone battery would drain unevenly, losing several percent at once, and then holding steady for hours. And even though I no longer received messages, the phone still felt involved, like a residual node in a larger system. And sometimes, when I held it, I felt a faint warmth, not from use, but from presence, like something resting its attention there briefly before moving on. And I stopped charging it overnight, because the idea of it being connected to anything else while I slept made my skin crawl, and sleep itself became fragmented, not because I woke up often, but because I never felt fully unconscious. Like part of me stayed alert, monitoring the silence for shifts. And once I dreamed that I was sitting in my apartment, exactly as it is now, except the walls extended farther than they should have, and the windows opened into more rooms instead of outside. And every room looked familiar, but not identical, like variations on memory. And when I woke up, I had the distinct sense that I had been shown something practical, not symbolic. And that sense lingered long enough for me to realize that the dream hadn't been about fear. It had been about orientation. And after that, I started noticing spaces differently, like how hallways seemed longer when I was anxious, or shorter when I was calm, and how certain rooms felt denser than others, as if they contained more attention. And one evening, while visiting a friend, I felt that pressure suddenly spike so sharply that I had to sit down, and my Friend asked if I was okay, and I said yes, automatically. Even though I knew that wasn't the right answer, because the pressure eased only slightly, not fully, and I realized that honesty might be another unspoken rule. Not honesty in the moral sense, but in the perceptual sense, acknowledging what was happening, instead of smoothing it over. And later, when I was alone again, the knock returned softer than it had been in days, and I felt an odd sense of approval. Not like praise, but like confirmation that I had aligned with something correctly, and that scared me because it meant the system responded to internal adjustments, not just external actions. And I wondered how many of my thoughts were still entirely my own, and how many had been shaped gradually through repetition and feedback until they fit neatly into a pattern I hadn't agreed to. And I tried to recall what my baseline anxiety felt like before all this started, but the memory was fuzzy, as if that version of me had been archived, and occasionally when I tried to focus on that earlier self, I felt resistance, like pushing against a surface that pushed back just enough to discourage effort. And I began to suspect that remembering too clearly might count as deviation. And I wasn't sure what the consequences of deviation were, but I sensed they weren't immediate or dramatic. They would be subtle, like increased dissonance or misalignment that would make everyday life harder to navigate. And that possibility kept me cautious. And sometimes, when I sat quietly doing nothing, the pressure would ease entirely. And those moments felt dangerous because they made me wonder if I was being ignored. And I found myself deliberately thinking about the presence just to feel it return, which made me uncomfortable because it meant I was seeking attention from something I didn't understand. And that realization felt like another test, and the knock would answer eventually. Faint but unmistakable, and I would feel that same complex relief and dread settle in, and I noticed that these exchanges never left any physical trace, nothing I could point to or explain. And that isolation made it worse because there was no way to validate the experience externally. And I started to understand why the messages had said, "You're not the only one who notices, but you're the one who listens," because noticing alone might be common, but listening implies compliance and curiosity and willingness to adjust. And I wondered how many others had noticed briefly and then dismissed it or ignored it, and whether the system tracked them differently or let them drift out of range. And I couldn't decide which fate was preferable. And lately, the silence has been stretching again. Not empty, exactly, just less communicative. And I can't tell if that means I'm being left alone, or if I'm being trusted to maintain alignment without feedback. And that uncertainty follows me everywhere, like a shadow that doesn't always match my movements. And sometimes when I catch that mismatch, I feel the pressure tighten briefly, like a reminder to pay attention. And I do, because paying attention feels safer than drifting. And as long as I remain aware, I feel like I'm still within whatever boundary was established that first night. And I don't know what happens when awareness fades completely, but I suspect that's when the rules change again. And I don't want to be surprised by that, because surprises feel like failures in this system. And I have the growing sense that failure doesn't mean punishment, it means correction. And I don't know what form correction takes once the pattern decides you've strayed too far to adjust on your own. Lately, the corrections have felt closer to the surface, like the system doesn't need to reach as far to nudge me back. And sometimes the nudge comes as a thought that doesn't quite feel like mine, such as the sudden certainty that I should pause mid-step, or the urge to reread a sentence I've already understood. And at first I resisted labeling those moments because naming them would make them more real. But over time, I accepted that they were part of the same pattern that had always been there, just quieter and more integrated. And once I stopped pushing against them, they became less forceful, which worried me because it suggested that resistance was the variable being measured, and compliance was simply the absence of friction. And I began to question whether comfort itself was another signal. Something monitored and adjusted, and I noticed that on days when I felt particularly calm, the silence grew thicker, almost expectant, like it was waiting to see if I would notice the absence of disturbance and do something with it. And on days when I was anxious, the knock would return more readily, as if to stabilize me, and I started to wonder if fear was actually less useful to whatever this was than steady awareness. And that idea unsettled me deeply because it meant my emotional responses weren't being exploited. In the way I expected, they were being tuned, and tuning implies long-term intent, not momentary effect. And I found myself scanning my environment for signs of escalation, something overt that would confirm my fears, but everything remained stubbornly ordinary, which made it harder to justify alarm and easier to rationalize accommodation. And I began to suspect that the most significant changes were happening internally in the way I prioritized information and filtered stimuli. And one afternoon, while sitting on a bus, I realized I was unconsciously mapping the space around me, not visually, but in terms of attention, density, noticing where people's focus lingered or drifted. And when I became aware I was doing it, the pressure flickered briefly like a nod, and that was the first time I felt a sense of collaboration instead of surveillance. And that frightened me more than anything else, because collaboration implies shared purpose, and I didn't know what that purpose was. And I didn't remember agreeing to it, and yet my behavior suggested otherwise. And I began to wonder if the system didn't need explicit consent, because it operated at a level where consent was redefined as continued participation. And every time I noticed and adjusted, I was participating, and withdrawal would require not just ignoring it, but unlearning the habit of awareness itself, which felt impossible now. And I tried to test that by deliberately distracting myself, immersing in noise or constant input. But even then, I felt the system adapting, tracking the way my attention fragmented and reassembling itself around that. And I realized that distraction wasn't escape. It was just another data point. And sometimes, in the midst of all that noise, I would feel the pressure briefly sharpen, like a reminder that clarity still mattered. And I would find myself seeking quiet again, not because it was comfortable, but because it felt aligned. And that realization made me pause, because alignment had become a goal without me consciously choosing it. And I wondered how many of my preferences had shifted gradually under the influence of subtle reinforcement, until they no longer felt external. And I thought about the early messages, the way they framed things as observations rather than commands, and how effective that had been at guiding me without triggering defiance. And I started to see similar patterns in my own thoughts, now phrasing adjustments to myself as realizations instead of decisions. And the idea that I might be replicating the same mechanism internally unsettled me deeply, because it suggested the system's greatest success wasn't monitoring me, but teaching me how to monitor myself in its absence. And one night, while lying awake, I felt that pressure settle. Not at the back of my neck, but across my chest, broad and steady, like a weight evenly distributed. And instead of panic, I felt a strange sense of completeness, like a feedback loop had closed, and the knock followed. Not from any direction, but from within my head, a soft internal echo that didn't hurt or startle, just confirmed presence. And in that moment, I understood that the boundary between observer and participant had blurred beyond usefulness, and I wasn't sure which side I was on anymore. And the realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and almost tender. And that scared me, because it meant the system didn't rely on fear to maintain influence. It relied on familiarity and continuity, and I remembered something it had said early on about being ready to notice without it, and I wondered if that readiness was the true threshold, not the end of communication, but its internalization. And if that was the case, then the silence wasn't an absence at all. It was the system functioning as intended through me. And that thought followed me into the next day, and the next, and I found myself moving through life with a heightened sense of coherence, noticing how events linked together subtly, and how my responses smoothed potential disruptions before they fully formed, and part of me took pride in that efficiency, while another part recoiled at how natural it felt. And occasionally, when I catch that reflection, lag just a fraction, or hear that hollow knock echo faintly in an empty room, I feel a ripple of uncertainty, like a reminder that this state isn't permanent or static. It's maintained, and maintenance implies ongoing evaluation. And I don't know what happens if the evaluation concludes, or if conclusions are even part of the design, and sometimes late at night when the silence feels especially attentive. I wonder if the system is still watching me, or if I've become one of the things it watches through. And that thought lingers without resolution, like a question that doesn't require an answer, to remain active. And I continue listening, not for instructions or warnings, but for shifts, because shifts are the only reliable signal now. And as long as I can still detect them, I believe I'm still within whatever margin of autonomy remains, and when the pressure settles, gently, reminding me that awareness persists, I accept it not as comfort, but as context. And I fall asleep, knowing that even in rest, some part of me is still aligned, still counted, still present within a pattern that doesn't need to announce itself anymore to be close.